This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and talk to industry experts about debt, money, and personal finance. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Today I've got a first-time guest who has a very interesting story about getting out of debt. She can tell her story better than I can, so let's get started. Who are you and what do you do?
Hey everyone, my name is Melanie Lockert. I write the blog Dear Debt. It is a blog about breaking up with debt, and it's all about my journey about climbing out of $81,000 in student loan debt.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for being here. And Melanie, I really want to hear this story. So why don't we start with the backstory then? So you said climbing out of $81,000 worth of debt. So first of all, let's start with how did you get into this debt? Did you go on some big spending spree? Were you traveling the world? What happened to get you into this level of debt?
That would be a lot more glamorous.
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah.
But unfortunately, all of my debt is educational debt. I got my undergrad at Cal State Long Beach and was a pretty affordable state school and got $23,000 worth of debt there. But really where I got into a lot of debt was I went to my dream school, which was NYU, for graduate school, and took on another $58,000 in debt going there. And
wow. And so when did you finish graduate school? What year are we talking about?
May 2011.
May 2011. Okay. And so when you finished school, you had $81,000 worth of debt, you said.
Not at that point. At that point, I actually had $68,000 left because from when I graduated in 2006 with my undergrad, and then by the time I graduated in May 2011 with my MA, I had paid off, $10,000, $13,000 or so. And so it was down to $68,000 at that time. But, in total, for the past, 8 years, I've been paying off $81,000 total. But when I graduated in May 2011, I had $68,000 left.
Which is still a big number, obviously.
Yeah.
So what was the time period between your undergraduate degree and going back to school to do your master's?
So I would say I worked full-time for 3 years between my undergrad and graduate degree. And during that time, I just paid the minimum on my debt, which is why, it sounds like a lot from $81,000 to $68,000. But that was over 3 or 4 years that, just paying the minimum. And then once I graduated with my MA in 2011, I still had $68,000 left, and just was a huge wake-up call. I was like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? I have so much debt, and it felt so overwhelming because I had really high interest rates because graduate plus loans in the States, at that time had 6.8 and 7.9% interest rates. So it was quite expensive for me to have so much of my loans. I think 58 of that whole 68 was the graduate plus loans at high interest rates.
Wow. And we're going to talk about your website in a minute, but so walk me through then you kind of already hit on it, the psychology of having that much debt. So when you finished your second round of schooling and had this $68,000 worth of debt, what was your mindset? Were you freaking out? Were you blasé about it? Where were you at mentally with it?
I was panicking. I felt so anxious about it. I felt stressed. I felt depressed. It's actually quite funny. I remember I wanted to really get my finances together after I graduated, so I signed up with Mint to track my finances and my loans and all this kind of stuff, and I swear I must have been on Mint for at least 2 to 3 days, and I saw my total debt number in black and white compared to my income, and I deleted the whole thing. Like, I just could not deal with it. I deleted the app. I couldn't deal with it. I just felt so completely overwhelmed with my situation, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this debt. I just felt so paralyzing at the time.
That's interesting. So, and you're talking about mint.com, I guess, MINT, which is a site that can pull your banking information, details from your different, financial accounts. And so it wasn't until you really saw it in black and white in front of you that the enormity of the situation hit you?
Mm-hmm. Just seeing it in black and white and seeing what I really owed, the interest rates, and especially compared to my income, my bills, it just felt so completely overwhelming.
And that's interesting because obviously you're an educated person. You've got 2 degrees. So it's not like you weren't aware that you had this debt, but it didn't become real to you until you saw it in black and white or black and green, whatever color it was on the screen. That's what really made it real to you.
Yeah.
And so you had this, epiphany where you said, oh my goodness, I got this huge amount of debt. So your first response was denial. Let's delete the app. Maybe it'll make it go away. I'm guessing that didn't work. So
No, really.
What happened next then?
So, I knew that I was getting into debt going to grad school, but it didn't really hit me until once I graduated and I realized, I don't have all these opportunities knocking down my door like I thought I would. And I'm living in New York City, a very expensive part of the country, to not have a full-time job. I had all these part-time jobs cobbled together, but it was barely enough to cover my rent and my bills. And so I was freaking out. And, at that point, I really got into making more money on the side because I had to. My current jobs were barely just paying my bills. And it was really important for me that I stick to my student loan payments and start paying those things off even before the grace period was over with. Even started, rather.
And so your primary strategy for dealing with the debt was increase your income as much as possible.
Yes. At that time in particular, because I was making such a little amount of money and, that income was going straight to my bills. So I just figured out how can I really just increase my income quickly at that time.
Which makes sense because mathematically, there's only 2 things you can do. You've either got to raise your income or reduce your expenses. Mm-hmm. And even if you reduce your expenses to 0, there's still only so much money coming in. So
bills.
Yeah, that's right. And you can't reduce it to 0. You're right. You've still got bills. So we're going to talk a bit as well about raising your income, but let's talk a bit about your website then. So the URL is deardebt.com. And the title of the website is Dear Debt. It's a blog about breaking up with debt. So when did you start that website?
Yeah, I started the blog in January 2013. It was called Do or Debt at that time, and I officially rebranded as Dear Debt, in July of 2013 after I got some clarity about my vision and my goals for the site. I really felt like I wanted to create a space online where I talked about the emotions related to debt. I had been a personal finance lover for a few years, really trying to consume information to help me get out of debt. But I kept feeling like there was something was missing, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it until one day, in that July 2013, after I had been blogging for a few months already, and I thought, this is what's missing. I feel like we're not addressing this human part of debt, this relationship part of debt. And, money affects our emotions. It affects our relationships. So I just thought it would be a fun, cute way to talk about money is, blog about breaking up with debt. I write breakup letters to debt. I invite other people to write breakup letters to debt. I encourage starting a conversation, with people that are feeling, down and out. And I encourage people to feel empowered by writing a letter and saying, Dear Debt, it's over. We are completely through. I'm moving on.
A breakup letter with debt. And that's a very interesting perspective. Your perspective is completely different than mine because I'm an accountant. And so to me, it's numbers. Let's crunch the numbers. Can we reduce $10 here? Can we increase $10 there? And obviously, you've had to look at the numbers. You're not ignoring the numbers, but you're looking at this from a much more emotional point of view because what you're saying is debt does have a significant impact on your psychological well-being. I guess that's really the point of writing a letter to debt.
Definitely. And if you think about it, personal finance is all about the numbers, but it really is about the emotions, psychology, and relationships. Because if it really was just about spend less, earn more, all of us would be rich and never face debt. And, we'd all be successful. But a lot of us aren't. And that's because we're dealing with these money issues, these emotional issues that come out, through debt and finances and a scarcity mindset. And there's so much to deal with. So a lot of my blog is about facing that money mindset, really empowering yourself to take back your life and really get financially empowered.
And I really like one of the lines in your Dear Debt manifesto. You said that Dear Debt was founded on a few principles. Everyone matters and we can all learn from each other. So that's the reason for having people write letters to debt that everyone can read. Although we're all in debt for different reasons, we're in this together and we'll help inspire each other to get out of debt. There is no judgment. And then my favorite line, you are not alone. You are not alone. And so you got to see it in writing to fully grasp that, but you are not the word, and then loan, L-O-A-N. What does that phrase mean to you then? You are not alone. You are not alone. What are you trying to say with that line in your Dear Debt manifesto?
What I'm trying to say is that just because you're in debt, it doesn't mean that that debt defines you or that, makes you a bad person. I know when I was in so much debt and I couldn't really find a job, and I just thought, what did I do? I went to this fancy private school. I can't pay it back. I don't have the opportunities to support this. And what did I do? And I just internalized that debt so much. And I think especially as women, we can really internalize some of these things as personal failures. And so that line is really to encourage other people to say, we've all made mistakes. Some of us, gone to fancy private schools that we couldn't afford, or gotten into credit card debt, or, some people haven't done anything and they've gotten into medical debt. Whatever the situation may be, we are not our debt. We are more than that. And that I think it's really important to remember that when we're paying off debt, because it can feel so isolating. It can feel so depressing and frustrating, like this is all my fault. And, it can be an emotional experience. So I just want to encourage people to know that they are not alone. They are not alone.
It's cool. Now, you said that debt does not define you, and you made the comment about another area about which I'm not an expert, and that is you said that you think this affects women differently.
Not particularly. I'm just making a reference, mostly personal, in my experience as a woman, and from what I've observed in other women, that I think it's very easy to internalize certain things and blame it on ourselves.
So let's get into the practical advice then. And again, speaking to someone who has paid off a significant amount of debt. So you just gave us one tip there, and that's don't internalize. Mm-hmm. So, okay, don't internalize is a negative statement. What's the positive thing that I can be doing then? Obviously, one of the things, I guess, is actually writing a letter to debt. Is that a way to not internalize it?
Yeah, I think, what I've heard from people that have written Dear Debt letters is that it is such a cathartic process, because once you sit down with a pen and paper or, a keyboard and put your little fingers to action, you can really sort of get rid of those negative emotions and really take back your life. And from that point, say, Dear Debt, we're over with. And you can address those thoughts and those feelings that you've been dealing with for the past few years and just start fresh. And I think that's what I want to offer people, is this opportunity to really start fresh with their debt and start thinking about themselves and their lives differently.
So if someone is listening to this today, I'm trying to kind of make the point forms here. So is the first step to do kind of what you did with Mint, which is I need to see it in front of me?
Yes, definitely. If you are currently in debt, definitely don't bury your head in the sand. I know it's so tempting, but you have to face those numbers, even as painful as it is. You have to know how much you owe, and also the interest rates. I think the interest rates are so important. They may seem secondary, but I think, for me, I had 3 different interest rates, 2.3, 6.8, and 7.9. And so I focused on paying off the high interest debt first, because that's where the majority of my balance was at, and it was costing me so much money in interest every day.
And you have to focus on the interest rates, again, because that makes it real, I guess, and helps you show which ones you need to pay off first. And I agree with you. It's not just because I guess it was the highest amount of debt, but if the highest interest rate is where the biggest bang for the buck is. If I'm paying the highest one off first, I'm saving the most interest by doing that. So okay, you need to see the numbers in writing and not internalize it. In other words, stand up to it, and writing a Dear Debt letter is a great way to start. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to the show notes, but it's, again, pretty easy website to find, deardebt.com. And you've got a link there called Dear Debt Letters. And in fact, one of them is written by my partner, Ted Michaelis, who obviously from a slightly different perspective than someone who's in debt, but he's written one on there too. So what is step 3 then? So I've made a list. I see what the scope of the problem is. I've mentally said I'm going to attack it head on. Mm-hmm. Then what?
Then go through your budget and your expenses and question everything. See if you can get anything cheaper. See if you can get rid of an expense altogether, especially those recurring expenses. Like, do you really need a gym membership? Are you really using Netflix? Are you really using that magazine subscription? Those things can kind of just be recurring and constantly charging you money, but you might not be using them all the time. So think about, what expenses you can cut out completely. See what expenses you can just lower. Sometimes you can lower some of your bills by just calling your service provider, for your internet, for your phone, just by asking. It doesn't hurt to ask. And in addition, I would say sometimes you have to make hard sacrifices if you're really wanting to get debt-free sooner rather than later. I did eventually move from New York City because I realized it was too expensive for me to pay off debt, especially because I didn't have a full-time job. So I moved to Portland, Oregon to be with my partner, and, also just live in a lower cost of living area.
Sounds like a motorcycle area too.
And we have a very small studio apartment. So if you can hear that, you guys are experiencing what I've had to do to pay off debt, and that's live in a very small studio apartment with my partner.
But I think that's a great illustration of it then. If you want to generate the excess cash flow each month, you can't spend more than you've got coming in. So it means living in a small apartment, not living in a big place. It means, in your case, moving literally from one end of the country to the other. Mm-hmm. These are significant sacrifices. Do you think the sacrifice will ultimately be worth it?
Oh, definitely. What I always tell people is that I've really had to think differently about what I thought my life would look like right now. I mean, I'm 31 years old, and a lot of my friends have houses, they're getting married, they're having children. I still live like a college student and live in a very small studio apartment with my partner that's facing the street. And, I moved to another city, which I didn't really want to do. We have all free or used stuff from Craigslist. I've had to make some mental changes and say, this is what I thought my life should or would look like at this age, but I'm okay with making these sacrifices for now because I know it's only temporary and it will get me to the bigger goal of getting out of debt.
And so you said you're 31 years old now. When you're 40 years old looking back on this, what's your situation going to be? Presumably you won't be living in this exact apartment.
No, I will not. No, I definitely have big goals once I'm debt-free, and I want to probably move to a bigger city again, but actually be able to afford it, and definitely, not go too crazy. I don't want to have the lifestyle inflation, totally go off the other end, but, start prioritizing travel and prioritizing some other things that I've put off for the past couple of years.
And so I don't want to say suffering the pain now, but you're making the choices now to get the debt eliminated. You're going to be able to start saving money, I guess, at some point in the next year, probably. Mm-hmm. And that then builds you up to the point where you've got the flexibility to live where you want. At this point right now, you're hamstrung by the debt. You mm-hmm. can't just go move to a different city. Well, I guess you could, but it makes more sense to stay where you are now. But for you, it's a long-term journey then, and you're close to the end of one phase of it and looking forward to the next one then.
Yeah, it's all about choices. I think a lot of people don't want to do what I've done, and that's totally fine. I don't judge anybody that, doesn't want to take such extreme measures. But I think if you're really serious about getting out of debt, you really do have to think of what choices need to be made. And sometimes they're not the most fun or the most glamorous, but they are temporary.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great way to end the segment. You have to make choices. That's what it all comes down to. And in your case, they were conscious choices. You crunched the numbers, you looked at the numbers, and you made that decision. And you're, I assume, quite comfortable with the choices you've made and where you're at.
I am now. I will have to say, moving from New York to Portland was quite difficult for me. I'm a big city girl at heart, and even though Portland's not the smallest place in the world, it was pretty small for me, and it was a pretty rough transition, culture shock wise, just environment wise. So, it was a rough start for sure, especially, coming from New York, coming from grad school, thinking that I was going to have this certain kind of life and then absolutely not having that kind of life. So definitely there was a point of transition and change that was kind of difficult on me emotionally, but where I'm at now that I'm closer to the end and I can actually see the light at the end of the tunnel, I know that it's been worth it.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that, Melanie. Thanks very much for being here with us today. DearDebt.com is where people can find you. I'll be back with the next segment in a moment after this break. You're listening to Debt Free in 30.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Welcome back. It's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. On today's show, Melanie Lockert shared her experience with debt and said that it's important that we don't let debt define us. She said it's important not to internalize our struggles with debt, and that's why writing a letter to debt can be cathartic and can help you get on track to be debt-free. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. So what's my take on Melanie's approach? As I said on the show, I'm an accountant, a numbers guy, but I fully acknowledge that debt is more than just numbers. It can be depressing and cause emotional issues, so it's important to recognize the negative impact debt is having on your life and take steps to deal with it. Melanie's approach makes sense. Make a list of all of your debt with interest rates so you can see the problem, and then question all of your expenses and make the lifestyle choices necessary to free up cash and get out of debt. It's not easy, but as Melanie has demonstrated by paying off a lot of debt, it works. That's our show for today. Full show notes are available on our website, including links to Melanie's DearDebt.com website and links to things like consumer proposals, which are often necessary to deal with debt. So please go to our website at hoyes.com, that's HOYES.com, for more information. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.
Thanks for listening. That was Debt Free in 30.